The moment Secrecy cracked as hypersonic missiles moved closer to NATO. The moment that changes everything is not a missile launch or a battlefield advance, but a claim about knowledge itself. Because when Ukraine's president openly stated that his intelligence services know where Russia's most secret hypersonic missile systems are positioned, including units placed on Belarusian soil, the conflict quietly crossed a line where secrecy became the primary battlefield, and information itself turned into the decisive weapon shaping perception, fear, and strategic calculation. What happened next is where the real rupture appears. Because instead of silence or cautious denial, the response from Belarusian intelligence leadership came wrapped in public dismissal and ridicule, a reaction that, in my opinion, was not designed to calm audiences, but to signal confidence, deterrence, and institutional control, at a moment when doubt alone could carry consequences far beyond words. This exchange matters because it reframes the war away from trenches and drones and toward an intelligence confrontation in which claims of access, exposure, and counter-espionage become tools to influence allies, adversaries, and civilian populations at the same time, creating a layered psychological environment where every statement is also a test of credibility. When the Belarusian counterintelligence chief insisted that the locations of the missile systems remain among the most tightly guarded state secrets and assured citizens they could sleep well, what happened beneath the surface was an attempt to reinforce internal stability, while also warning external actors that any presumed intelligence success would be publicly invalidated rather than quietly corrected. The missile system at the center of this confrontation is not treated as an abstract concept, but as a symbol of irreversible escalation. Because its description as a nuclear-capable hypersonic weapon immediately elevates the stakes from conventional warfare to deterrence logic, where uncertainty itself becomes a form of pressure exerted on neighboring states and alliances. In this context, the claim that some of these systems are being deployed under joint defense arrangements inside Belarus places the issue squarely on the edge of the alliance boundary, transforming a regional deployment into a broader strategic message aimed at those who read distance, reaction time, and warning windows as indicators of vulnerability. The intensity of intelligence interest surrounding these deployments reveals how much the war has shifted into parallel layers, where missiles may remain hidden, but assumptions about their location, readiness, and purpose circulate constantly, shaping military planning and diplomatic language long before any physical action occurs. What stands out, in my opinion, is how the Belarusian response did not stop at denial, but expanded into warnings about what was described as transit terrorism, a phrase that reframes intelligence operations as existential threats and prepares domestic audiences for a future where counterintelligence activity is justified as defensive necessity rather than political choice. By linking alleged sabotage tactics and covert recruitment methods to Ukrainian intelligence practices, the Belarusian narrative places responsibility for escalation not on deployments or deterrence moves, but on unseen actors operating in the shadows, which is a classic way to shift the moral burden of risk away from the state and onto external adversaries. The assertion that dozens of foreign agents have been exposed and prosecuted reinforces this narrative by offering a sense of ongoing vigilance and success, even though the absence of detail preserves secrecy, while still amplifying the perception that an invisible war is already well underway. This is where the analysis becomes less about numbers and more about atmosphere. Because when officials speak confidently about countering espionage, while refusing to reveal specifics, the intended effect is not transparency, but deterrence through ambiguity, leaving observers unsure where intelligence advantages truly lie. The intelligence clash described here runs parallel to battlefield developments, but follows its own logic, one where credibility, consistency, and narrative dominance determine who is believed, who is doubted, and who is forced into reactive positions rather than proactive ones. As missiles remain hidden and accusations continue to circulate, the confrontation moves into darker territory, where the absence of proof becomes part of the strategy, because neither side benefits from revealing too much, and both rely on selective disclosure to influence partners and adversaries simultaneously. This shift matters deeply for audiences in the United States because it illustrates how modern conflict increasingly depends on what can be claimed rather than what can be shown, and how intelligence statements alone can trigger diplomatic reactions, funding debates, and alliance recalculations far from the front lines. The emphasis on secrecy and counter-secrecy also signals a loss of the original equilibrium, because once leaders openly discuss intelligence penetration or its denial, the assumption of stable hidden systems collapses and is replaced by constant suspicion and defensive posture. In my view, this is the point where the war's character subtly changes, as intelligence agencies move from supporting roles into the spotlight, becoming both actors and subjects of public messaging designed to shape fear, confidence, and political resolve. The warnings about potential attacks and the insistence that armed forces are already designated for rapid response underline how intelligence rhetoric is being paired with readiness language, creating a feedback loop where statements justify preparations and preparations justify statements. When Belarusian leadership speaks of immediate engagement and assured support from Russia, the message is not only military but psychological, signaling that escalation scenarios are already mentally rehearsed and institutionally normalized, rather than treated as distant hypotheticals. This normalization of readiness erodes the sense of pause or restraint that once existed, replacing it with a standing assumption that conflict could widen at any moment depending on decisions made far from public view. Taken together, these elements form the opening act of a broader transformation, where intelligence claims, missile deployments, and public reassurance merge into a single narrative of inevitability that quietly prepares audiences for outcomes that once seemed unthinkable. The second shift unfolds when missile secrecy collides with financial pressure, because at the same time these systems are quietly placed on combat duty closer to NATO's eastern edge. Ukraine's leadership is publicly warning that without sustained external funding, its ability to maintain both military resistance and economic stability will narrow dramatically, creating a convergence where money, deterrence, and time become inseparable variables. When Volodymyr Zelensky presses European leaders for a loan backed by frozen Russian assets, the request is framed not as optional support, but as a decisive lever that will determine whether Ukraine can continue to operate across multiple fronts, from drone production to basic state functions. And this framing signals how close strategic endurance has come to a financial breaking point. What happened behind closed doors in Brussels reveals a deeper fracture. Because while some leaders view immediate support as essential to prevent Moscow from gaining momentum, others fear the legal and economic consequences of using frozen assets, exposing a hesitation that contrasts sharply with the certainty projected by missile deployments in Belarus. This contrast matters because it creates asymmetry in resolve, where one side communicates inevitability and readiness, while the other debates procedure and risk. And in my opinion, that imbalance alone reshapes perception long before any new action is taken on the ground. The confirmation by Alexander Lukashenko that the missile system is now on combat duty adds a new layer of finality, because operational status implies decisions have already been made, timelines set, and escalation thresholds quietly adjusted without public negotiation. When Vladimir Putin reinforces this message by confirming the system's entry into service, the signal extends beyond Ukraine and Belarus toward every capital calculating response times and deterrence credibility, especially given claims about speed, interception resistance, and dual payload capability. The psychological impact of a weapon that cannot be identified as conventional or nuclear before impact is profound, because it forces adversaries into worst-case planning and compresses decision windows in ways that increase the risk of miscalculation rather than reduce it. This is where the intelligence clash from earlier connects directly to deterrence logic, because uncertainty about location, readiness, and intent becomes an intentional feature rather than a flaw, compelling opponents to assume maximum threat in the absence of verifiable reassurance. At the same time, Ukraine's warnings that reduced funding would limit drone production introduce a different kind of vulnerability, one rooted not in secrecy but in visibility, where openly stated constraints invite adversaries to anticipate capability gaps and adjust pressure accordingly.